We see interdependence in global politics when actors have mutual reliance on one another, have shared interests, or some sort of impact on each other. And global governance is the collection of systems and institutions that create the rules and customs that enable this cooperation to happen smoothly. Let's start here by looking at some of the international organizations, or IGOs, that established this global governance system in the first place. And the biggie, as you probably already know, is the United Nations. The United Nations was formed after the Second World War, where the victorious powers got together and thought about creating a system where diplomatically states would be able to resolve their differences without having to go to war. And so the United Nations was established with the aim of preserving global security, but also upholding human rights and fostering global development. We can see some of these central principles of the UN enshrined in the UN Charter. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from the treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Right? So the UN Charter aims to really clearly define that all states should be working together to achieve these lofty goals. And so a lot of the work the UN does, especially through the UN Security Council and UN Security Council resolutions, forms the basis of international law around the world. And so is a major backbone of the global governance system in the world today. Another major global governance organization, and one that aims to provide collective security, is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This one was also formed after the Second World War, and this one as a response to the growing bipolar world of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, and the United States and its allies in the Western Hemisphere around the Atlantic, which is why the organization is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Right? And it's not the North American Treaty Organization. A lot of people seem to get that wrong, so don't be that person. Right? And with this one, we see interdependence because all these member countries in NATO have realized that by having this security alliance, they're stronger together against outside threats and rely on each other to provide this security. An important part of NATO is what's known as Article 5, which states that if any one member nation of NATO is attacked, all of the NATO members are pledged to come to its defense. Article 5 has only been invoked one time, however, and that was in the wake of the bombing of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001 in the United States. In terms of economic cooperation, creating that economic interdependence is the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. It was established in 1995 as the successor to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or what was known as GATT. The WTO guides free trade between states and aims to reduce barriers to trade, such as tariffs. It also has a dispute resolution mechanism, where if states feel like other states aren't really playing by the rules of free trade and their agreements between them, they can take those disputes to the WTO for mediation. And now one international organization that has a good deal more power over its member states than some of these others we've talked about is the European Union. Now, the EU does kind of work as somewhat of a supranational organization where states elect members to sit on the European Parliament, and the European Parliament does make rules that member states have to follow, such as policies regarding the EU's single market or border access and border controls. And unlike decisions made by some of those other mentioned IGOs, states are bound by EU decisions. Many of these EU member states see this cooperation as beneficial, despite the infringement on their state sovereignty. But maybe not all states. Hi, Great Britain. Or should we say, by Great Britain. Now, in addition to these intergovernmental organizations or IGOs that form this system of global governance that foster this interdependence and cooperation between states, we also have a series of treaties that different states have signed on to that also help form this body of international law and global governance. And there's lots of examples to pick from, so let's just focus on a couple here. The first is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty signed in 1970. Now, the ultimate goal with something like these treaties on nuclear weapons is nuclear disarmament, but this one specifically looks at making sure that states that currently do not have nuclear weapons continue to not have nuclear weapons, and that nuclear power stays with the states that have it. And since this treaty was signed, most states around the world have not developed nuclear weapons. But, however, states like India, Pakistan, and North Korea have been developing nuclear weapons, and others have programs in operation as well. Some critics of something like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty have stated that it just helps support the global balance of power where you have these limited powerful states and other states are totally shut out of that power. Whereas others would say that, well, fewer nuclear weapons in the world is probably a good thing. Another example is the Paris Agreement signed in 2016 that aims to tackle climate change. And 191 countries have signed on to this agreement. And the ultimate goal with this one is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning to more clean and sustainable forms of energy. But again, to what extent are nations meeting their targets? Often the states that are the biggest emitters are also the largest economies in the world. And so it's a tricky balance to find between economic growth and preserving economic growth and sustainability, right? So let's think back to this idea of global governance more generally. All of these systems and institutions aim to promote this cooperation and interdependence between states and try to create this idea that states should work together for mutual benefit. But a big question here is, to what extent is that effective? At the end of the day, most of these international treaties and most of these intergovernmental organizations or IGOs, like the UN, a lot of the decisions they make aren't binding, and states still have the sovereignty to choose how and when to actually abide by a lot of these treaties. So what compels states to follow them? Obviously, a lot of countries just want to play nice because, you do something along with the global community now, which means later on, other states will return the favor. And so there's a little bit of that at play. On the flip side, there's also the danger that going against some of these treaties or decisions made by like the UN or the UN Security Council might lead to other states imposing sanctions on a belligerent state or things like that. So while there's no formal enforcement mechanism behind a lot of these, there are tools in the global toolbox, if you will, to ensure compliance. But a big question remains of how effective global governance is at all, with not very many teeth to actually enforce much of the international law that's out there. But again, is it still better than having no systems at all in place to begin with? And states likely wouldn't agree to much with more teeth, so maybe a lot of these systems in their weaker form are again better than not having anything at all. Now, this whole idea of interdependence and global governance is a very important principle of the international relations theory of liberalism that champions states being connected and working together for the common good of all. On the other hand, realists would probably downplay it, that even states that join into these international agreements or treaties are still working for their own interests at the end of the day, right? So what do you think? What incentives do countries have in order to play by these global customs established by this system of global governance around the world? Let us know in the comments below. And if you learned something today, give this video a like, subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss anything in the future, and we'll see you again next time.